why impose tariffs that you know are hurting American businesses?
They're not hurting, they're helping because they're creating jobs in America. We're creating tremendous amounts of jobs in America like you've never seen.
Now says it will shut down 4 chicken plants. The facilities, 2 in Missouri and 1 each in Arkansas and Indiana, employ about 3,000 people.
Including 2 here in Missouri. Those plants will be closing in both Dexter and Noel, Missouri.
Tyson plant in Van Buren has closed a day earlier than expected. That according to employees who worked there. Almost 1,000 people now out of a job.
A Tyson Foods factory in Indiana has just shut down without warning, without compensation, and without a second thought for the thousands of workers it left behind. In one quiet internal memo, livelihoods were erased, families thrown into chaos, and a key pillar of America's food system quietly collapsed. This wasn't just a business decision. It was the first crack in what many now fear is a full-scale retreat. Tyson, the once proud symbol of Made in USA, is pulling out from the very communities it helped build, leaving behind empty factories, shuttered stores, and school children forced to move because their parents can no longer afford to stay. While politicians still shout, "Bring jobs," hometowns across Indiana, Missouri, and Iowa are turning into ghostlands. What was promised as revival now feels like betrayal. So how did a slogan meant to restore American strength lead to one of the most devastating implosions in the country's food industry? As Tyson plants go dark, the shockwaves aren't just felt by workers. They're hitting families across the country, one grocery trip at a time. According to the Federal Reserve's May 2025 report, the food index rose 2.9% over the past year. That number on its own doesn't scream crisis. But for families living paycheck to paycheck, it means real sacrifices.
Tyson just raised prices by 20%, citing inflation, like it's some magical thing.
A few dollars more for ground beef, another $1.50 for a dozen eggs. Fresh vegetables up by 15 to 20%. These increases aren't theoretical, they change how families plan every meal. And it's not just homes feeling the strain. Schools are quietly cutting back. Districts facing higher food costs are reducing portion sizes, especially meat, while raising the price of school lunches. In some cases, students are skipping meals entirely, not because they want to, but because their parents can no longer afford the daily charge. Teachers and cafeteria workers report rising frustration, hunger, and absenteeism. Small towns are seeing their store shelves thin out. Local grocers that relied heavily on Tyson's supply chain now scramble to find alternative sources. But in many rural areas, there are no alternatives. Some shops have shuttered temporarily, others have been forced to raise prices sharply just to cover the new supply costs. In places where wages haven't moved in years, that gap is devastating. The breakdown is cascading downward from corporate restructuring to retail disruption to household pressure. And for millions of Americans, the pain is only beginning to register. It started in Perry, Iowa. One announcement, no warning. And just like that, 300 jobs vanished. For a small town where nearly 2/3 of those workers lived locally, it wasn't just the factory that went quiet, it was the grocery store, the gas station, the elementary school. City officials called it a crisis. Residents called it betrayal. But the collapse didn't stop there. In Noel, Missouri, a town of just over 2,000, the Tyson shutdown erased nearly 1,500 jobs in a single blow. Within days, restaurants closed, rental homes emptied, and the heart of the town seemed to stop beating. There were no protests, no headlines, just silence. In Dexter, it was 683 jobs gone. But that was enough to trigger a chain reaction. Schools lost funding, small businesses lost customers, and families began packing up and leaving. The town wasn't just losing income, it was losing people. Across the Midwest, the pattern repeated. One factory closure didn't mean one problem, it meant dozens. Every job lost was tied to 3 or 4 more. Every paycheck that vanished took local commerce down with it. What was once a tightly woven system of workers, shops, schools, and services began to collapse inward town by town, family by family, and it all unraveled far faster than anyone expected. As towns emptied and factories fell silent, the aftershocks kept traveling outward past the city lines beyond the last convenience store and straight into the countryside. For contract farmers who had long raised poultry for Tyson, the shutdowns didn't just mean uncertainty, they meant collapse. Many had poured their life savings and taken on new debt to meet Tyson's standards, build bigger chicken houses, install specific ventilation systems, stick to exact schedules. In return, they were promised stable contracts and guaranteed pickups. But once the company pulled out, Those promises vanished, the birds kept growing, the trucks stopped coming, and suddenly thousands of animals had no destination. Some farmers were forced to sell at rock-bottom prices far below the cost of raising them. Others had no choice but to euthanize entire flocks, watching months of labor and hope disappear in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, banks began tightening the screws. With no active contracts, new financing became almost impossible. Farmers once seen as low risk were now flagged as liabilities. Those still holding debt, often taken out on Tyson's recommendations, faced foreclosure. Some lost their homes, others lost land that had been in their family for generations. And unlike factories' farms, don't shutter quietly. The pain lingers in silos still half full in fields that won't be planted again, and in communities where the only thing left moving is the wind. What began as isolated shutdowns in small towns and rippled into farms and families has now exposed something far deeper. A system already cracking beneath the surface, one pushed over the edge by political decisions that promised strength but delivered strain. The 2025 tariff hikes were sold as a revival plan: protect American industry, bring jobs back, make companies invest at home. In reality, they served a narrow few. Steel manufacturers may have seen a temporary boost, but across the rest of the economy, especially in food production, the consequences have been brutal. For companies like Tyson, already operating on thin margins and complex logistics, the spike in input costs was catastrophic. Steel for equipment, aluminum for packaging, and fuel for transport all became more expensive overnight. And instead of reshoring jobs or building new plants, the response was blunt-cut operations/payroll and abandoned regions where costs couldn't be contained. No new Tyson facilities opened in the United States. Not in the Midwest, not in the South, not anywhere. The jobs lost weren't replaced. The communities hollowed out weren't rebuilt. Meanwhile, the supply chain itself has begun to fracture. Trucking companies laid off drivers as shipment volumes plummeted. Cold storage facilities sat half empty. Food processors further down the line faced delay shortages and rising costs they couldn't absorb. Yet in Washington, the headlines still spoke of victory. Numbers were spun, slogans were repeated. But on the ground, the disconnect was unmistakable. What was billed as national strength has turned for many into quiet, grinding loss. Tyson didn't collapse by accident. It walked away strategically, coldly, and with numbers to justify every exit. After the 2025 tariff hikes, steel prices doubled almost overnight. Packaging materials, imported machinery, transportation costs all surged under the weight of new import taxes. For a company that relies on metal equipment, refrigerated freight, and industrial-scale packaging, the pressure wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unsustainable. Facing mounting costs, Tyson made a choice not to adapt, not to invest, but to retreat. Plants were shut down, production lines went silent, and the company quietly began shifting its operations to places where labor was cheaper. Regulations were looser, and shipping costs, ironically, were often lower overseas than within the U.S. heartland. Even as American towns unraveled, Tyson received nearly $3 billion in government subsidies and pandemic-era relief. But instead of rebuilding or rehiring it, cut thousands of jobs using that cash to cushion its transition, not reverse it. There was no announcement of betrayal, no memo titled "We're leaving you behind," just spreadsheets, quarterly reports, and decisions that on paper made perfect corporate sense. Tyson didn't fall. It pivoted, and the people it left behind were never part of the long-term plan. While towns across the Midwest were still reeling from job losses, Tyson's future was already taking shape, just not in America. New investments were announced in China, Thailand, and the Netherlands aimed at capturing growing markets and lowering production costs. At home, the company didn't rebuild where it had just withdrawn. Instead, it shifted quietly to the non-union South, favoring cheaper labor and fewer restrictions. The communities that had once formed the backbone of its domestic supply chain were no longer part of the equation. For many, this wasn't just a business decision. It was a betrayal of everything they had been promised. The phrase "America First," once printed on banners and repeated in town halls, had been quietly rewritten. In its place, a colder logic took hold, one that answered not to workers or hometowns, but to shareholders and quarterly margins. No speeches were made, no apologies offered, just redirection, swift, strategic, and final. Donald Trump vowed that tariffs would bring factories back and force companies like Tyson to invest in America again. But the result was the opposite. Tyson shut down over a dozen plants, cut more than 5,000 jobs, and abandoned the very towns that believed in the promise. In places like Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas, immigrant workers, longtime employees, and entire families were left without work, without warning, and without support. What Trump sold as a revival turned into a retreat, and for thousands bring jobs home now feels like the cruelest lie of all. Tyson framed its decision to shut down plants as a necessary step to boost efficiency, claiming it was actively supporting workers and farmers through the transition. But for many, that support either came too late or never came at all. Promises of smooth transitions quickly faded into the harsh reality of lost income, mounting debt, and families being forced to uproot their lives. In Perry, Iowa, state officials rushed to respond, launching job fairs, setting up retraining programs, and urging local businesses to absorb the wave of newly unemployed workers. But the gap between policy announcements and real-world recovery was wide, especially in towns already on the economic edge. Even the Iowa Cattlemen's Association raised alarm bells, warning that the closures could trigger long-term widespread damage to rural economies. And for many small communities, that warning is no longer a prediction, it's already come true. Tyson didn't collapse, it calculated. And as the factories went dark and paychecks vanished every day, Americans were told to move on to transition, as if decades of loyalty could be folded up and filed away like another quarterly report. The banners once read, "Bring jobs home." But today all that remains are shuttered plants, quiet streets, and communities left to clean up a mess they didn't make. It makes you wonder, was this the plan all along, or just collateral damage disguised as progress? We want to hear your thoughts. How do you see what's happening in your own town, your own grocery store, your own paycheck? Drop a comment below, we're listening.